Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the entire congregation, I welcome you to the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Shenandoah Valley. My name is the Reverend Henry Tickner, Minister Emeritus of this congregation, and I'm your worship associate for today. We gather together with our doubts as well as our convictions, with our fears and our hopes, with our failures and our aspirations, with our sorrows and our joys. Whether you are joining us today for the first time or have been a long-time member or friend for many years, we are glad you are here. Whatever faiths you have known, if any, whatever your background, whoever you are, whomever you love, however you arrived here, you are welcome. I'm pleased to say that this morning's guest speaker is Catherine Tickner Robinson. And yes, there is some intentional last name. I'm very proud of my daughter. Catherine is a sociolinguist and director of research at InVibe Labs. She uses a variety of research methods to understand what people say, how they say it, and why it matters. With over 10 years of experience working in the healthcare sector, Catherine consults with a variety of clients, including life science companies, hospital systems, and nonprofit organizations. She holds degrees from the College of William and Mary and Georgetown University. Catherine lives in Richmond, Virginia, with her husband, 2 border collies, and 2 cats. Our opening words this morning are by the Reverend Everett Howe, entitled The Common Room. How does it happen, this transformation? Arriving from many different directions, one bearing snacks, another the workday's toll of tension, one anxious for a family dinner, one thinking still of the parent in the sickbed or the child, one joyful from a day well spent, and one still processing the pain of another revealed in deep confidence. How do we do it? How do we become whole, a body, each listening to the other, accepting ideas not our own, building together, wiser and more compassionate than any of us alone, creating and calling the spirit of life, living the spirit of love, and then leaving, returning home or to the workplace, to the family or the empty room, to the sick parent or child, to walk quietly before sleep, thinking of this day. How do we come together? How do we make this time sacred? And now, as Nancy comes forward to light our chalice, let us all say together the words for our chalice lighting. In the light of truth and the warmth of love, we gather to seek, to sustain, and to share. And I invite you to share together with me as we say our covenant. Love is the spirit of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament. To dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in freedom, and to help our neighbor. To these ends, we covenant one with another.
Please join with me in a time of silence as we hold in our hearts all those in our nation and the world who are struggling with challenges and losses from the continuing COVID-19 pandemic, racial and economic inequalities and injustices, and the hardships and devastations related to climate change. Our words of meditation this morning are from our hymnal reading number 480. Let us open our minds and hearts to the place of quiet, to the silent prayer for the healing of pain and the soft, gentle coming of love. Our words of reflection today are by the Reverend Gary Kowalski from the UUA Worship Web, Listening with the Heart. Maybe prayer doesn't mean talking to God at all. Maybe it means just listening, unplugging the TV, turning off the computer, quieting the mental chatter and distractions. Maybe it means listening to the birds and the insects, the wind in the leaves, the creaking and groaning of the trees, noticing who else is out there, not far away, but nearby. Sitting so still we can hear our heartbeat, watch our breath, the gentle whoosh of air, the funny noises from our own insides, marveling at the body we take so much for granted. Maybe it means listening to our dreams, paying more attention to what we really want from life, and less attention to all the nagging, scolding voices from our past. Or maybe it's all about listening to each other, not thinking ahead to how we can answer or rebut or parry or advise or admonish, but actually being present to each other. Perhaps if we just sit quietly, we'll overhear a peace whispering through the centuries that's missing from the clamor of the moment. Maybe prayer means listening to the silences between the words, noticing the negativity of space, the vast, undifferentiated, and nameless wonder that underlies it all. Maybe prayer doesn't mean talking to God at all, but listening with the heart to the angel choirs all around us, those who have ears, let them hear.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Catherine Tickner Robinson, and it is such a pleasure to be speaking with you this morning. As many of you know, I was raised in the UU faith, and I've had the opportunity to worship many times at UUCSB. So I'm honored to be back with you again, albeit virtually. In my professional life, I am a researcher and a sociolinguist, and throughout my career, I have spent a lot of time listening. Whether to patients speaking with their physicians, to patients talking to other patients and caregivers, physicians speaking with their peers, sometimes even people talking to themselves, probably myself included in that category. However, I'm usually brought in when there's been a miscommunication, when something has gone wrong in the conversation, in the discourse, and we're trying to figure out why. So we need to be very particular in our listening to diagnose what's gone wrong in that situation. Now, just to take a step back for a moment, what do we mean exactly when we say linguistics? Well, quite simply, linguistics is the scientific study of language. There are lots of linguists out there doing very interesting things, from helping to preserve our endangered indigenous languages to much more day-to-day efforts, such as helping Alexa to understand us all a little bit better when we're asking questions. But as a sociolinguist for myself personally, I have focused in healthcare. And I use a lot of different techniques of listening and analyzing language to try to identify patterns and gaps between what people mean, what people say, and how these things can go wrong when interacting. Sometimes if I describe myself as a professional listener, I get some smiles, and I can understand that because, well, in a way, aren't we all? And I totally understand. Listening, watching, conversation, these things are absolutely central to us as people. And we, in fact, even learn to listen, to comprehend language before we learn to speak. They often say that comprehension comes before production. So listening is our sort of most basic skill set when it comes to communication. But as we get older, we become a little bit better. This whole communication thing comes a bit more naturally to us. We actually stop paying as close attention to the conversations taking around us. Those listening and observation skills that were so important to us as children as we were acquiring language can start to atrophy a bit. And essentially, we can become sort of unreliable witnesses to the conversations taking place around us. Those details become hidden. I'll share a quote from a linguist and philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein, that I think speaks to this very matter. He says, the aspect of things that are most important for us are hidden because of their simplicity and their familiarity. One is unable to notice something because it's always right before our eyes. Now, I think this quote can apply to many different things in life, but language for sure. I'll get into some specifics. Every year, researchers review medical malpractice suits and different situations in which patients have brought forth either legal action or just a complaint against their healthcare provider. And overwhelmingly, the dominant theme in these studies and findings is that there has been a breakdown in the physician-patient relationship. And in most cases, that is manifested as unsatisfactory physician-patient communication. Upwards of 80% of medical malpractice suits are due to that most sort of simple and familiar of aspects of language failing us when we're at our most vulnerable. Next, I've brought up on the screen an iceberg diagram. I'm sure most folks have seen this in different contexts, but it kind of talks about what are those aspects of language that we tend to be the most aware of around us versus those aspects of language that can start to become hidden. Those things that we typically are aware of, things like the actual words that we're saying, right? Our word choice. Tone of voice. Typically, we're still savvy enough to pick up on when someone is using a negative or positive tone, and body language, right? These are things we tend to be tuned into. But there is so much else going on. Things that we are using in our communication without even realizing it, things that have become so automatic to us. Things like our personal conversational style, assumptions of shared knowledge with other groups, cultural norms, things like how we expect to demonstrate politeness in conversation and expect politeness to be shared back to us, whether that's by being personal and showing interest in others, or by holding off and not prying. There's everything is a spectrum here, and a lot of these issues come up when we don't have that shared assumption of, for example, what politeness is, what an expression of empathy is that the person that we're speaking with does. So let's go back to those medical malpractice suits for a moment. What were some of the examples that patients were providing? I'll just read a few. My physician wouldn't listen to me. My physician wouldn't speak openly with me. My physician didn't warn me of the long-term risks. My physician felt distant and unavailable. My physician didn't value my family's values. My physician had poor communication and delivered information poorly, and my physician failed to understand my perspective. So I think reading this list, we can see how many of these are that below, the below the waterline here. These things that are a lot harder for us to pick up on, especially under such high pressure, often extremely time crunched situations such as doctor-patient communication, not to mention what we'll get to in a moment, the cognitive burden and heightened emotional state that most of us are in, physicians included, clinicians included, during most medical interactions. So now that we kind of have a lay of the land of what the problem is, what can we do about it? Well, this morning I'd love to share with you what I like to call usually my linguistic toolkit, but I think for this morning I'll be referring to it as a conversational first aid kit. Because what I'd love everyone to be able to do is come away with a little bit more of an understanding, and maybe even some strategies for diagnosing what might go wrong in a conversation when there's a misunderstanding, when there's a point of confusion, even a hurt feeling, and possibly some ways to exercise a little preventative health in our conversations and communications to bring, again, that healing back into these interactions that are so central to us, especially in a healthcare context. One of the first things to be aware of are these very subtle parts of language, to refer back to the quote that we heard earlier, that can be hidden throughout our conversations with our medical providers, that can cause us a lot of trouble without us necessarily noticing. It was in fact this realization that actually made me want to become a healthcare focused linguist, because I noticed these little everyday words contributing to a lot of miscommunication. It wasn't the big medical jargon terminology that was causing these headaches, because typically clinicians would stop when they came to one of these buzzwords, if you will, make sure the patient understood what are we talking about in terms of these various more difficult terms. But they were using a host of more everyday language with a very specific context or connotation. To give a few examples, your results were positive. Your cough is productive. Your enzymes are elevated. Elevated, productive, positive, all being used with a very specific connotation and definition there, but three words that we all can use outside of the medical context with a very different connotation. So, for example, just to take the idea of the results were positive, oftentimes if we see that there are patients or individuals who are not coming for follow-up, who maybe did not go back to pick up a prescription, one of the first things we do is look to make sure that they did in fact understand what their lab results were, and would look for that word positive just to make sure that it was communicated that in fact the diagnosis was of X, Y, or Z, and not that they walked away with an understanding that something good had transpired. Now, for those of us who have had a little bit more experience in a medical setting. We talk about that being a little bit of an acquired speech competency. We might think to ourselves, well, I will definitely know what my doctor is talking about if they were to tell me that my results were positive. And that could be. But there's a lot going on when we are in one of these medical visits. And some of these differences extend beyond just the word level. We've identified a stylistic difference that is ingrained deeply in terms of how medical providers, clinicians often are communicating versus how we are used to communicating. So for our healthcare providers, often through their training, they have been taught and ingrained to take what we'll call a report style or an informational style, where the goal is to, as efficiently and accurately as possible, diagnose what is happening. Oftentimes, there's a mental checklist of potential conditions, potential treatment options, things to rule out. And by nature, they've been taught to go through this checklist as quickly and efficiently as possible. On our side, we're not privy to that checklist. We're not privy to the various options that they might be considering, symptoms to rule out or rule in, etc. So instead, we're taking what we might call a rapport or a relational standpoint. So again, just report versus rapport, informational versus relational. And instead of trying to simply provide the information for them to rule in or out various conditions that could help, we want to make sure that they understand the full context. We want to provide a narrative. This is naturally how we communicate with others. So we typically want to go back in time, let them know where it all started, provide understanding of how it's impacting us. But these two conversational styles often do not jive. And it is very easy for us on the patient caregiver side to perceive that our physicians are not showing empathy or not understanding our perspective during these conversations. Likewise, it's very easy for clinicians to sort of hope that we will get back on track, kind of stop telling their story and just give them the information that they need. Now, of course, these are not universals. There are certainly physicians who are wonderful at adopting that narrative rapport with their patients, and vice versa. There are those who just want to, provide their physicians with the facts. But just being aware of these general patterns and these general cognitive mindsets that we can often take, and where those can lead to trouble, is really important. Can be really, really helpful, especially during more difficult or emotionally trying diagnoses and health visits, where we found that people are often only processing about 50% of the information that they're taking in. So just being aware of that as you're in your visits, where are there areas where I might be perceiving a poor bedside manner, but really it's this different stylistic approach. What can we do to help out with some of these things that I've mentioned? The first thing that I always recommend is to bring a second set of ears, right? Everything that we've talked about so far is, pointing to the fact that there's a lot going on cognitively here. Not only are we trying to maintain a conversation with someone, not only are we trying to make sure that our physician understands where we're coming from, but we're also processing new information, whether it's about a condition, a treatment, our options, what the long-term may look like. But it is quite a bit for our brains to handle at the moment. If we try to include also critical thinking and asking questions at the time, it can be a lot to ask. So for our experience, we really, really encourage you to bring that second set of ears. That person's job is to do sort of the critical thinking, the asking of follow-up questions, be thinking about things that we may not be thinking about in the moment. This can certainly be a spouse, a family member. It's also completely fine for that person to be someone who maybe has a little bit more emotional distance from the situation, a friend, a church member who might be able to come support you during that time. And many practices also have what they'll call patient advocates, nurse navigators, etc., who are very experienced in accompanying patients, making sure that we understand what's being told, making sure that physicians and clinicians also understand our perspective during this time. Making sure you have an advocate so that you can focus on listening and someone else can focus on asking the questions. This now brings me to our third and final point, which is exciting for me because I get to mention a possibly little bit of variation in the research on whether or not she was a UU, but you all can probably guess, Florence Nightingale. So my third and final point for you all is to advocate for taking notes. Now, Florence Nightingale is just a classic example of note-taking paying off. I think most of us probably know of her in terms of being a social reformer, the founder of modern nursing, but she was also an avid note-taker. She was also a contributor to the field of statistics. She was cited as inventing the pie chart. And this avid note-taking that she was known for really paid off for her. Because she observed that when the sun was shining, the windows were open and air was circulating, people in her hospitals got better faster. And her findings around sanitation in hospital settings are still being used today. We, as I'm sure many of you know, now have very bright, light, and most importantly, well-ventilated medical facilities and practices. So very, very important. Now, I'm not suggesting that you all need to go out and take notes on the entire hospital. Take notes on yourself, your own care. Get into the habit of documenting, whether it's in a diary, a journal, a notebook. You can even audio record your own visits with your clinician. Most are happy to let you record on your mobile phone or in a little recording device, so that you can start to understand your own body, your own health, your own patterns a little bit more clearly. And it can really provide some certainty, some data for yourself to feel a little bit more confident in. So just to recap, I think what I hope you've taken away today is the value of looking and listening closer to those everyday words that can oftentimes trip us up without us noticing. Second, to bring a second set of ears to support you, to be your question asker so that you can be in full listening mode, and to take notes, to start to see those patterns, to see the value of what might be helping you over time and your own healing. I'll leave you with just 2 quotes around listening. First, that genuine listening is hard work. There is little about it that is mechanical. We hear with our ears, but we also listen with our eyes and our mind and our heart and our skin and guts as well. And then last, the activity of interpreting might well be understood as listening for the song beneath the words. Thank you so much.
And now, as Nancy comes forward to extinguish the flame, let us say together the words for extinguishing our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of love, the warmth of our community, or the truth of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we meet again. Our closing words are from the Reverend Dr. Cynthia Landrum, also taken from the Unitarian Universalist Worship Web. We leave this gathered community, but we don't leave our connections. our concerns, and our cares for one another. Our service to each other, to the world, and to our faith continues. Until we are together again, friends, be strong, be well, be true, be loving. Amen, and blessed be.
The purpose of the church is to encourage all who gather to grow more generous in spirit and in action. We hope you will consider making an offering after today's service through our web page, uushenandoah.org, which allows us to exercise that generosity of spirit for this self-supporting church and its many ministries. And we invite you to join our church community at noon for our virtual post-service gatherings for joys and concerns, followed by our coffee hour conversations in smaller breakout groups. The Zoom link is found in your UUCSV email. Thank you so much for joining us today. Stay safe, stay strong, and we look forward to seeing you next time.